Welcome to Cine Bijou, where we delve into the diverse creative world of independent film with your host, Ramon Wrights.
Hello everyone, so glad you tuned in. Every fortnight through feature explorations and insightfully fun interviews, we'll make Cine Bijou your destination for discovering hidden gems and supporting the voices of indie films that deserve to be heard. So grab your popcorn and settle into your seats as we shine a spotlight on emerging filmmakers, thought-provoking narratives, and groundbreaking techniques that redefine the art of storytelling.
Going to the movies!
Things are about to get spooky here on Cine Bijou as we go in search of a new chapter, exploring another golden era of horror cinema. Guiding us through this journey is our regular annual feature guest, writer, director and producer David Weiner, who previously took us on a similar journey but through the garish and groundbreaking age of 80s horror in the first In Search of Darkness trilogy. David and the team at Creative VC are now back, and for this journey they take us into the lost decade of horror, a time when the genre was self-reflective and searching for an identity. Reportedly at nearly 6 hours long, the longest documentary in the series to date, In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994, features new and familiar faces of that decade, sharing insights and stories about this thought-provoking era in horror cinema. So grab your popcorn, dim the lights, and let's get into it. So when we spoke last year, it was the pre-order campaign for In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994. So that was inviting people to order the films and then be involved throughout the 12 months that it was in production, or the 10 months it was in production. So now it's finished, and now fans have one more chance to own a copy and have their name in the credits and obtain all the features that go with it. So
you said it better than I could.
I doubt that very much. I've heard how I sound in audio, so trust me. But thank you, I appreciate that. So one significant difference about this, apart from the era that you're covering, is the previous In Search of Darkness trilogy, which focused on the 80s, was all about looking at the decade from 80 to 89 and focusing on specific films and film types, like the European films, particularly the Italian horror and Asian cinema. And then the final installment of the trilogy was all about the B movies. And the sort of the films that stop the shelves of the mom and pop video stores. But you've done something different here. You've decided to cover from 1990 to 1994. For those who are unaware, or for those who don't, can we just have a little reminder of why you chose to focus on that block of that decade?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, for first In Search of Darkness, which covered 80s horror, as you mentioned. It goes from 1980 to 1989. We cover a number of films each year. Then there's larger context chapters in between. And the first one was a 4+ hour film. And by the time we got to the third one, we were in 5+ hour territory, all encouraged by the audience. This time around, with the 90s, we were excited to start a new decade. But I kind of thought that if we divide it in two parts, it might be a little more manageable in two different ways. One, just in terms of the amount of effort that goes into making these. As you can imagine, if you're making a 4 to 5 hour plus documentary, it's considerable. Perhaps we thought it would be a little easier on us. On the other hand, also there's a significant amount of material that of amazing films, but also television I wanted to add this year, which was different, or this time around, not this year. Giving, whether you're talking about studio films, shot on video films, television miniseries like, It, or The Stand, Stephen King kind of stuff. Um, I kind of figured we could pack more in each year rather than do 90 to 99 and then go around and start doing a part two and then maybe go around for a third time, depending on audience demand, and do a third time like we did with the 80s. The thing is, there's just so much amazing material, but doesn't matter how long these films are, inevitably, films slip through the cracks. They don't make it. They don't make the final cut. We can't even get to it. Lots of television the same way. So that was the approach. But I'll just say lastly about this choice, I think it's really interesting because the first half of the 90s decade was really a big transition era for horror films. And there was lots of balance between brand new material where filmmakers were trying to stretch, cater to an audience that was a little more demanding for intellectual content. But at the same time, the party was really not over at all for the 80s icons, whether it was Freddy, Jason, Pinhead, Chucky. They just kept on going in sequels and reinventions and whatnot. And at the end of the day, how is this different? Not that much, because it's now the longest In Search of Darkness I've made yet. So did not do the 3-hour film that I thought I might make.
So in putting this together then, given the different approach and the longer film with so much content just in that half decade, never mind what comes from 95 onwards, which will be no doubt the subject of the next film.
Correct.
How is this different for you in your approach and any prep that you did? Did you revisit any titles that you might have forgotten about or hadn't seen in so long to reacquaint? What did you do to get ready for this?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the audience demand for the people who really appreciate these films, people were ready to go to a new decade, and the cacophony was overwhelming for more, but 90s horror. Let's start a new decade. And it's interesting because there's lots of hardcore horror fans who love this era, but there's lots of casual horror fans or just horror appreciators who are like, 90s, I don't know what happened really. It wasn't much until Scream came along. They think of one or two titles, maybe Bram Stoker's Dracula, maybe Silence of the Lambs, and even that, is that horror or is that a thriller? What is that exactly? When we decided that the 90s would be something that could be a viable next step, I revisited all the titles, at least visually, because I saw so many of them when I was in the 90s, when I was in my 20s, my early 20s, when I started working in the entertainment industry myself. So I went to every single movie theater, caught every single movie. I felt it was part of my job and training to know about what was going on in the industry, what movies are being made, why are movies hits, what are misses, and also try and raid the video store shelves as much as possible. But to answer your question, there were a lot of titles that I was like, oh gosh, that's right, there's this one, and oh, there's that one, or ooh, now's a good excuse to sort of check this one out that I've always wanted to check out, but I might have dismissed or didn't even know it existed or remember people talking about, but just, in our lives, we can't get to everything, This is incredibly fertile ground. And it tells a really interesting story about, like I said, a time of transition and what people arguably consider a lost decade if they weren't paying too much attention. So for me, it was very, very fun with, of course, the best homework in the world. I get to rewatch a lot of these movies and watch for the first time these movies that really felt like a time capsule, if not from the early 90s. It even kind of felt like a 80s leftover time capsule, because people don't, you could draw a fine line, which is exactly what we do at the last day of 1889 and the first day of 1990. But as we all know, there is no difference right around that time. It takes a couple of years for any decade to really sort of obtain some sort of identity.
Now, it's interesting that you say that, and also you mentioned about how these films came out when you were in your 20s and you were working. I mean, both were in our 20s in that decade. Because previously, when we talked about the other In Search of Darkness films, those were films of a time when we were children, well, not children, we were teenagers, searching for our own identities, going through the pains of puberty, but discovering this treasure trove, if you like, of
I wouldn't call
films.
it pains of puberty. If anything, these movies helped my puberty. Just to clarify,
Fair enough. Okay.
helped me along to understand and to maybe question what I was watching.
Fair enough. And I suppose also, again, it was those films came out at a very influential time. But as adults, when we're now making our way into the world in our 20s, we've kind of decided what we want to do and we're on track for that. How has your view been of this era compared to looking back at the 80s?
Well, I could say that when I was like a good example of not sort of tangentially answering your question is I remember I saw Wes Craven's New Nightmare when it came out in '94, and I remember seeing that in the theater. And I remember it kind of resonated with me because part of it is there's earthquakes in there. That was the time after the Northridge quake, living in California. Earthquakes are very much on our minds, and you think that's sort of neither here nor there now. But back then, it was very relevant, and it just happened to be a bit serendipitous when they were filming it that they were experiencing the exact same stuff, and it just happened to be in the script, which is kind of neat. But fundamentally, that movie is about it's meta filmmaking. It's self-reflexive, and it very much is a great identifier of the types of films that were getting momentum in the early '90s compared to the '80s. '80s were not as self-reflexive, whereas the '90s were much more aware of films that were poking fun at themselves and people's knowledge of the industry and their knowledge of the genre. But the big difference when I say tangentially answering it is that I saw that movie, and yes, it's about Heather Langenkamp playing Heather Langenkamp, or a version of her that, would be her normal self. Wes Craven, the people at New Line Cinema, Bob Shea and such, Robert Englund, they're all playing themselves where Freddie comes. No, I hope it's not a spoiler at this point in time. Freddie is coming into the real world, but they're living in a world where the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is a hit franchise in Hollywood, and they're just Hollywood actors. But what I'm getting at is that Heather Langenkamp plays a mom, and she's struggling with her identity as a horror icon who also is having some family issues and real life danger based on her chosen profession as an actor that just happens to be in, a hit in horror. When I saw that, I thought that was cool and I thought that was interesting. But I look at that 30 years later. I look at that, I hadn't watched, I'd watched it maybe once or twice in between 30 years and now. Watching it again before I sat down with Heather Langenkamp to talk about it for In Search of Darkness 90 to 94. I had a whole new appreciation of that film and what it meant and how important it was, what it was saying about the industry, about parenthood, about the zeitgeist of horror films. It's a much more layered. It's a 10-layer dip, watching that film, and it meant so much to me, and I enjoyed it so much more because I'm a parent, and so I have all the concerns that all parents have about raising a kid and especially a young kid. It was really interesting, and it was very cool. I'll just add lastly is that it was very nice to be able to tell Heather, who loves that film and is very proud of that film, but it didn't do as well as they all thought it was going to do. So she kind of feels in the back of her mind, well, it's just not as big as the first one, and maybe Dream Warriors, but this one comes a third or later. And I just said, no, I think now this is my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film because it's so smart.
Mm-hmm. Do you
It
think
resonates
maybe?
with me.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I sort of feel the same way as a grandfather myself, especially with the younger grandchild. I kind of have that sort of maternal urge or that protective urge, if you like. So, and really sort of when you're younger, I suppose you're aware of your own mortality and you think, well, there's nothing, I wouldn't sacrifice my life. But now I suppose it's very different. They're so, you know, they're such fragile creatures. You would do anything and you would give up everything to protect them. So I get that. But just touching on very quickly on Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is a very intelligent horror film, very
Mhm.
cleverly done. Why do you think it wasn't as successful as it deserved to be? Was it because it came off the back of Freddy's Dead, which the 3D gimmick kind of supposedly killed the franchise, or do you think maybe the expectation was more of the same and people were a little bit maybe taken aback by the intelligent side of the
I think,
story?
yeah, I think you are you're the points you bring up are part of the answer, very much so. I think it came a little close on the heels of Freddy's Dead, when Freddy, that's the name of the title. I'm not spoiling anything. Spoiler alert, Freddy dies and Freddy's dead. But I think it only came 3 years later. And I think it was a little too close. And I think the material was challenging because it was very different than one would expect. At this point, when you're watching a horror franchise and you're getting in the higher numbers, five, six, seven, eight, and so on, you're expecting your McDonald's cheeseburger to taste the same every time. And when it's radically different, say like Jason Goes to Hell, people are like, duh, new idea. Why are you doing this? But they'd still be upset if it's the same thing. You can't win either way. But I think with New Nightmare, ultimately, it was a challenging idea that I think was a little ahead of its time. It was a little too close on the heels. I think if it had been more like 6 or 7 years later or 10 years, I think it really would have resonated. And it also just happened to open on the same weekend as some film that no one talks about now called Pulp Fiction. Not sure if you've ever heard of it.
No, never heard of that film. Any good? Who's in that?
I don't know. I don't know. But apparently that stole the box office that weekend and the Thunder.
Yes, I can imagine it did. It's fair what you say about the timing of it. I suppose if it had been released sort of just after, say, Scream had come out when there was a real taste for that kind of reflective filmmaking. Although there were meta films across the genres before that, but Scream seems to be the one that is disingenuously how can I put this? It's disingenuously attributed to starting or
Yeah. Well,
carrying the meta style of filmmaking.
Scream stands on the shoulders of many types of films that came before it. And I'm sure Wes Craven would be the first person to acknowledge that. But it is what it is. It did incredibly well, and it for many people who were had tremendous fatigue for sort of the slasher genre. This was a reinvention that had a tremendous sense of humor and took on all the tropes head on and was still scary but still fun and funny and self-reflexive. I was going to point out also, like, a good distance between films is, you had Child's Play 2 came out in 90, Child's Play 3 came out in 91. Don Mancini, who's in our film, would be the first to say it was too fast coming out with that third sequel, and it paid the price for it. But there was a nice long break until 1998 when Bride of Chucky came along. So you had 7 years before Chucky reinvented himself with much more sense of humor, also very self-referential about making quips about Martha Stewart and Jeffrey Dahmer, in that film. And I think by the time that came along, people were, oh yeah, Chucky, I like Chucky. Oh, but now he's funny and he's smart, whip smart, and this is a very clever film and take on Bride of Frankenstein, I guess, somehow. And people sometimes need a break and then they can dive back in refreshed. I think we're all like that, even if we love the horror through and through and love the genre through and through.
That's very true. And the same happened with Michael Myers, the Halloween series. I think we mentioned last year actually about franchise fatigue, the main franchise films, that they were kind of dying out. People were a bit tired, but then I know in the late 90s there was a bit of a Halloween resurgence,
Hmm.
but it did pave the way, didn't it? I don't know if you found this in your research for the film and interviewing people like Charlie Band, who we'll go on to now. It paved the way for new franchises or ones that started at the end of the 80s to creep into the 90s and kind of take over, like the Puppet Master films and the
Hmm.
Subspecies films, both of them
Hmm.
helmed as producer by Charlie Band. So, do you think then that there really was a need for something refreshing, something different from what had come before?
Yeah, I think audiences are always looking for something fresh and new, and at the same time, they're looking for, like I said, that they want that reliable cheeseburger that always tastes the same. Because if you make if the cheeseburger becomes an Angus burger and it's the same thing, they're like, well, yeah, you made it better for me, but it's not what I wanted. Maybe that's a bad and tired analogy at this point, but it's kind of like that, and I think. There are certain avenues, it's sort of like sliding doors. You go in one time or another and you get a whole new, different world, a whole new life, a whole new path that you are kind of oblivious to until you're well on your way. And I think horror in the 90s really went all sorts of different directions. And I think audiences embraced this quite a bit, but it wasn't some defining thing. If anything, I think there was meta is one big defining thing. I mean, you can find that in all sorts of films. Gremlins 2 is really all about Gremlins 1 and making fun of Gremlins themselves within it, but also, media, Donald Trump, real estate, all sorts of things like that. But on the flip side, and Jason Goes to Hell, I'm going back to yet again because that one has all these amazing, fun, very entertaining Easter eggs. There's the crate from Creepshow. It just happens to be in there if you're looking closely. There's the jungle gym where the birds were hanging on in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, if you're paying attention. Even if you're not paying attention to either of those two, the Necronomicon from Evil Dead plays a central key pivotal role in that movie, sort of creating an opportunity for Jason to be demonic, and go from body to body to body. I think there were new ideas, maybe there was some new icing on the cake, new icing on the same old cake in certain ways, but there were other avenues going on where a movie like Candyman, you're introducing a brand new villain. It's very different from Leprechaun introducing a brand new villain. The Crypt Keeper on television, it's a brand new favorite of everybody, but it's not new. It's straight out of the comic books, the EC comic books, and horror hosts of the old days. So if my answer seems kind of all over the map, it's because that's what the decade was like, and you could tack on that A-list horror, became a big thing, whether it was Silence of the Lambs paving the way, where they said, oh my gosh, great box office, and won all the Oscars. Let's do 100 new serial killer subgenre films. But also you have, Jack Nicholson says, I want to play a werewolf. You have Bram Stoker's Dracula breaking new ground where Coppola is doing it. It's a hit. And now you do Mary Shelley's Dracula. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You do, Interview with a Vampire because Anne Rice is doing well. You do Mary Riley. Julia Roberts says, I want to do one too, and that's the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, for better or for worse, with what that film ended up as. But so much going on where I think, if anything, the definition of this decade was trying to find its identity. And that's why there's so much ground to cover.
And I suppose that ties in with, in the trailer, what David Dasmalkian says, who, by the way, I think has really hit the horror nail on the head this year with Late Night with the Devil, which I think
Great film.
absolutely great film. He described that particular era, didn't he, as edgier, grungier, and really searching for an identity. So, I mean, in getting ready for this film and the making of the film, speaking to people, just how varied were the films? I mean, I'll pick a few titles. On the one hand, you do have the Leprechaun franchise, but then you've got
Hmm.
Jacob's Ladder. You've
Hmm.
got Candyman, a ghost story, or you've got Ghost, not a horror film, more of a romance, but
Right.
supernatural. And then you've got on television Ghostwatch, the
All
BBC
right.
series, which I noticed that you featured, which is great. Just how varied and scattered were did you find that the films and the TV series of that era were?
It was all over the map, and I think that's how entertainment should be. I think when people, and we can touch on this later, but I'll mention it. I think one of the reasons why it is kind of a lost decade, or some people dismiss it, or they cannot remember, is I think a lot of it has to do with CGI, the explosion of CGI, and then ever so quickly bad CGI in the wake of amazing CGI in Jurassic Park and T2, morphing, whatever you may think of Sleepwalkers, the morphing is super cool and it's very fresh and new at the time. But people go straight to Lawnmower Man, which even in the context of that film, it was all about virtual reality, and that was the height of cutting edge technology at the time that you could show virtual reality. Did it age well? Only a couple of years later, not well. And it also had the stigma of being a Stephen King story that Stephen King disavowed because it's nothing like his Night Shift tale. But I think there was an absolute smorgasbord. There was so much variety. You did have those amazing full moon films where if you had an appreciation for low budget indie ingenuity, and you enjoyed these characters, especially when there'd be like stop motion animation that never quite went away in the 90s, at least according to Full Moon, entertainment. Or you have Freaked, by Alex Winter, which is just upside down, inside out, outrageous and hysterical and inventive and loaded with practical effects genius. But on the video store shelves, you'd see Dr. Giggles, or you'd see Carnosaur, from Roger Corman. Whatever you were in the mood for, there it was on the video store shelves. I'm going to sort of change tack with it's sort of a tangent, but I think it's an important thing. And it's me projecting to a certain degree. I dismissed a lot of stuff in the early 90s because if it hadn't been a theatrical release, I'd just say, yeah, Jack Frost, or Uncle Sam, or whatever the movie was. If it was straight to video, sometimes they come back again, that kind of stuff like that. I would just dismiss it because I'm like, well, if it wasn't good enough for a theatrical release, it's probably not going to be very good. But these are kind of the old standbys that would be around for quite some time. And at a certain point on a Friday night, every time you walk by that video box art, you're like, all right, tonight's the night. Tonight's the night I got to watch The Suckling. Why not? It looks weird and crazy. Maybe there's some, the monster looks awesome. Maybe there's some great nudity in it. Maybe that's all I need. There's so much to choose from back then. And I think one of the wonderful elements of In Search of Darkness 1994 is I have the space to remind people that these were out there, introduce people by a certain level of curation to discover brand new titles that they might not have even known about, but to really sort of fairly get into all this stuff and have the people who are in front of the camera, behind the camera, talk about why this stuff was important and relevant to the times. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
That was a great answer. And as an aside, I know what you mean about the old direct-to-video releases. You kind of sort of, there was always some sense of snobbery attached.
Mm-hmm.
Not, that's probably a strong word, but there was a sense of snobbery attached to them. Oh, it's not as good as if it's not in the cinema, then what's it doing here? Yet people were tempted to go and see them and actually found some true gems.
And this audience, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to
No.
add to that this audience really fell in love with so many of these movies
Mm.
by discovering them themselves or having someone special or a friend,
Mhm.
introduce them. And I am the first to say that I went to film school, so I was the your stereotypical film school snob when it came to how I judged films in my 20s working in the film industry. Although I did work on some full moon entertainment movies. So
Mhm.
I was the last person who should be a snob because I'm working on these films that I would disdain on the shelf. So, but what I'm ultimately saying is, I kind of started out a bit snobby, but at a certain point, I came to appreciate and then love so many of these outrageous titles that never saw a movie theater ever, yet would sometimes get into the double digits when they were in sequels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did enjoy the Puppet Master films. I think I only saw the first three or four, and I think four was directed by Jeffrey Burr, who passed away last year because he did four
Mm,
and five, I believe. So I enjoyed those, and I look back on them now probably with a bit more appreciation again for the effort that goes into them. And I think that's. But what was interesting about that era, I don't know if you noticed this in your research, is that actually, although there will be people who have that sort of, well, it's video photo, not interested in that. Uh,
hmm
straight to video films grew in
hmm
in quantity and selection, but so did the video shops, video rental stores. They went from the small mom and pop outlets that we all like to frequent and browse to almost being like supermarket chains, and Blockbuster was the leader in that. And the 90s just seemed to be all about respectability. You had A-list actors in horror films, which
hmm
you would have only seen them in 80s films as the starting point in their careers, and now here they are at the pinnacle moments. So do you think that's maybe something that's happened with the 90s? It's made horror respectable, made it, you know, trendy, if you like?
I would say the first half of the 90s sure paved the way for more respectability. It does go back to Silence of the Lambs and Bram Stoker's Dracula, really sort of creating a template that made it acceptable, and horror being less of the quote unquote redheaded stepchild, as Tom Holland liked to say in the first In Search of Darkness. Um, but you hear from the mouth of, say, Mick Garris. There was not an air of respectability even getting into the 90s when it came to horror films. And there's a whole discussion. I think the answer ultimately is it paved the way. It got things going in the right direction, especially when the likes of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt and Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer, are all saying, put me in one, I'd like to do it. Or you could even look at, like, say, Exorcist 3, where you've got uh uh oh my gosh, we all know his name.
George C. Scott,
George C. Scott. Of course, Scott was
yes,
coming to my brain and everything else disappeared.
who
Yeah, George C.
played William Kinderman in the film, originally played by Lee J. Cobb in the first Exorcist film. Yes.
Exactly. Brought an absolute respectability to that film
Hmm.
and elevated it from, well, it's probably going to suck, but let's go on a Friday night because there's nothing else, to the greatest jump scare I've ever experienced in a theater. But yeah, these movies absolutely in the early 90s paved the way. But I was going to say also there was a whole uh, element of the marketing of the films where so many of these films, and this goes back to, maybe you could say, Fatal Attraction really sort of changed the direction of the way things went. Everyone wanted a Fatal Attraction, so all of a sudden you got these psychological thrillers or an erotic thriller. But there's murder, there's mayhem, but it's under the guise of it's a thriller. It's not horror, because if it's horror, less people are going to go. So we'll call it a thriller. Final Analysis, Single White Female, Hand the Rocks to Cradle, Sleeping with the Enemy. In these movies, people scream at that jump scare or the surprise reveal, or they thought the killer was dead, but
Hmm.
the killer comes up for one more attack.
Hmm.
These are scary things, and in real life, it would be horror. We have a nice chapter talking about what is the difference, what is in a label between thriller and horror, and it's really kind of fun. It's fun to have a lot of these folks who are in the documentary sharing their thoughts about this.
So, well, let's talk about what's going to be in the documentary without giving too much away. So, hold off on some spoilers. But you've got some familiar figures coming back. You've got Mick Garris in there. You've got David Dasmalkian. We've mentioned him before, but you've got some new faces in there as well, like James V. Hart, who I believe he wrote the script for Dracula,
Yeah, he wrote
and
Dracula and produced
uh,
Mary Shelley's Dracula as well.
yeah, Frank.
Sorry, I keep on saying Mary Shelley's Dracula. Whew.
That's a
I clearly need a little more caffeine, so cheers.
So you've got some new faces in there. So who? So without, and of course, another familiar face. You've got Charlie Band and Brian Yuzna, Screaming Mad George.
Hmm.
So, who have you managed to snag to appear and give their view and insight in the film? And what kind of things can we expect?
A couple. I wanted to have a nice balance of a couple return faces because the '80s was such a strong decade that it still shone brightly. The glow, the afterglow, the nuclear glow, was still going on in the '90s. So I wanted folks like Mick Garris coming back. I wanted Heather Langenkamp coming back, and Doug Bradley coming back, talking about Hellraiser 3 and being in Nightbreed and movies like that. This time around, I've got A. Michael Baldwin from Phantasm. He was in the first Phantasm, but he wasn't in the second Phantasm. They replaced him because it went very Hollywood. James LeGros played his character, but he's back in Phantasm 3 and 4 and beyond. So I'm a huge Phantasm fan. So super cool to have him there. Yeah, I don't want to get into a big laundry list, but there are plenty of faces reflecting a lot of these new films, whether it's, Bernard Rose, director of Candyman, or Jörg Buttgereit, who did the Necromantic series, and he
Mhm.
did Necromantic 2 in the 90s, and he did a serial killer film called Schramm, from the point of view of a serial killer. We went to Berlin for that shoot. Tim Balme, Balme, the star of Dead Alive, aka Brain Dead,
One of
went
my
to New Zealand.
favorites. Yeah.
Went to New Zealand for that, and it was just an absolute hoot talking to him. Super wonderful guy. Everyone, as with all the films that I've made, we've been so fortunate to have people who are happy to be there, happy to talk for an extended period of time, happy to reminisce and come up with some new tales. And for the most part, they get it. Sometimes people are still like, really, you care about that? Stephen Volk, for example, is a perfect example of that, who wrote Ghostwatch.
Mhm.
Very excited to have that. I was not one of the, because I did not grow up in the UK. I had no idea what Ghostwatch was until many years later. But to me, I absolutely can love and appreciate anything that pulls the wool over people's eyes, like H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds radio show,
Mhm.
where it goes on the air and people panic because they think it's real. And if you know nothing else about Ghostwatch, you could just read about it or watch In Search of Darkness '90s and have Stephen talk all about it. But what's cool also about having Stephen on is he wrote The Guardian, the 1990 William Friedkin film. And while Stephen is more than happy to talk about Ghostwatch, I say, let's talk about The Guardian. And he's kind of like, do we have to? Do you really want to? It was raked over the coals, or it didn't quite get the appreciation, and I think it was a bit of a trial by fire for him, having being vaulted into Hollywood and then working with, Hurricane William Friedkin, Billy Friedkin of The Exorcist, who does what he wants and wants what he does. And if you're in working with him, don't stand in his way. You got to just
No.
gotta take the ride. And so um some of these people are sometimes scratching their heads why people would appreciate some of the stuff that they are a little sore about still. John Carpenter, who's back with us talking about his '90s stuff, he's sort of the king of being self-effacing and saying, why were people interested in this, or it didn't do well, so I don't really have fond memories of it. But we all have amazing perceptions of so many of his films, especially in the '90s. And, it makes a big difference when you're telling them that our audience cares.
Mhm. Uh, An interesting thing about that Ghost Watch, I remember watching that, well, not live, but when it first broadcast. Obviously, it's before the days of streaming
Hmm.
and whatnot. And once it was on, that's it. Unless you set your VCR to record it, you missed it. So everybody was glued to the telly that night, and for, it was a very surreal experience. But it reminded me, seeing that clip in the trailer, it reminded me two things. One, you always manage to find something from the BBC to include in your documentary. So there was this, and I think in Search of Tomorrow, you mentioned the BBC series Threads, which is about
Hmm.
nuclear war hitting the UK. But also, it reminded me of our conversation about the Satanic Panic chapter of part three, in which people genuinely believed that if you played the record backwards, there was a message from the devil. And here we are in another decade, and people are watching this series and going, "Oh my God, did I just see what I thought I saw?" We need to phone this in. What is the government doing about it? And then it's all, oh,
Yeah.
it's okay. It's just a it's just a mock-up. Thank God. What is it about our need, do you think, to want to believe to, no pun, no link intended to the X-Files,
Right, right,
by the way,
exactly.
want to sort of believe that what we're seeing like that, no matter how terrifying it is, that it is real, what we're seeing, that there is this supernatural experience that's sending chills into our soul.
Well, as horror fans, the sort of the prototypical, sitting in the cave by the fire, telling stories, while the shadows flicker on the wall. It goes back to our sort of lizard brains that we really love to be entertained by creepy tales. And it's never quite gone away. And whether if you're not a genuine horror fan, and that's not a gatekeeping word about genuine. I'm just talking about they're horror fans, and then they're not, but there are people who experience horror, watch some horror, but they're just not fans for it. I think we are all one click away, one step away, one turn away from thinking that the supernatural is indeed real. I don't know, and who am I to say it's not? But what I'm saying is, there's our daily reality, and then there's the one lamp that falls when you're not in the room and you are terrified. It might have just been at the edge, and a truck went by and it fell on the ground, but you are now questioning whether or not you have ghosts in your house. And we all have that experience. I'm the first person to tell you that I don't really believe in ghosts, but if I hear a sound late at night, I am now questioning my religion and my reality, and I think we're all like that. And so, gosh, you sit down for a casual night of television, happens to be Halloween, you're already primed for, the night of, for Samhain and, spooky things going on. And you watch television and there's all hell breaking loose, and there's a real quote unquote poltergeist in a house. And then it takes, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it. It gets chaotic. It gets chaotic, and so people believe. People believe.
So
Sorry, I'm stopping myself because I don't want to.
you don't
I
want to
think I think
spoil
a
it for
lot of
people.
people have yet to see Ghost Watch who aren't in the UK. So I think.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think it was certainly one of the biggest watch programs of that year, and it
Oh, I'm
certainly
talking
had
about
people.
here. I'm talking about stateside,
Oh, stateside, yeah.
and then the years since. I think a lot of
Hmm.
fewer people have really know anything about it.
Um, but to sort of conclude the interview, I want to wrap up with a couple of questions. So, one of the main differences, we've mentioned this before, is that you feature more than just movies, but TV shows. We've already talked
Hmm.
about Ghostwatch to some extent and the
Hmm.
impact of that. So I suppose there's two things I'm curious about, what you've learned from exploring the television side. So with shows like X-Files, you mentioned quite prominently. What was it about television that seemed to be accepting of mainstream horror or episodes of horror that we didn't see in the 80s? And what I mean by that is, in the 80s, if there was like horror anthologies or TV shows about horror, they were always on at 10 o'clock at night, or
Hmm.
And if you wanted to watch them as a teenager, you had to set your VCR and hope your parents were in the room when you watched them. But what was it about the 90s that made TV horror for things like X-Files, The Outer Limits, especially that terrifying pilot episode, The Sand Kings?
Mhm.
What made it acceptable for television?
By the way, Sand Kings that's such a great episode. People should seek it out, the Sand Kings. Television is something that's always been they're always looking to the movies, the television executives. And if movies are doing well, if certain trends are happening, certain films hit, oftentimes on television, they quickly want to follow to do something like that. So people can sort of get a taste of it. Whether it's the TV show version of a film, or just elements from whatnot, The Exorcist, whatever they saw, they want to try and include that in some way, shape, or form in film. Sorry, in television on the small screen. And I think by the 90s, TV producers were recognizing, even though it's still the redheaded stepchild, that horror was big business and horror was always doing very well. And horror was always the talk of the water cooler. So I think they felt it was more acceptable to start doing a lot more horror on television, whether it was original horror or whether it was adapted horror, like you had, Freddy's Nightmares, or you had Friday the 13th, the
I was
series,
just going to say Friday the
which had
13th.
nothing to do with Friday the 13th with Jason, but it's a great, great anthology series. And even gateway horror, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Goosebumps, Erie, Indiana.
Erie, Indiana, yes.
Tangential horror, Twin Peaks has elements of horror in it. Absolutely. So there was so much more in the 90s. Stephen King very much paving the way with, a novel for television in the form of, Stephen King's It and The Stand and the Tommyknockers. They later in the decade, they totally redid The Shining. Mick Garris directed The Shining, which was the approved adaptation because King didn't like the Stanley Kubrick classic.
He didn't like Jack Nicholson. He didn't like Jack Nicholson, did he?
It messed with his personal story, and that's why he didn't like it. And I think that's pretty understandable. But to answer your question, there was so much there. Tales from the Crypt, you could still get away with a down, dirty, very violent, very sexual, very silly, all on HBO, because HBO, you could do anything you want, And so, and if you were, again, going back to gateway horror, and you always heard about Tales from the Crypt, but of course you couldn't watch it because you were a kid. On Saturday morning, you had the cartoon Tales from the Crypt Keeper, where you could have that and gateway horror, as cartoons. And it's cool. I have Gilbert Adler, the producer of all of the Tales from the Crypt, the entire series. He wrote several episodes and directed several episodes as well. But he also directed Bordello of Blood later in the decade and produced Demon Knight. The director of Demon Knight, Ernest Dickerson, who is also cinematographer of Death by Temptation. He's in our film. It all kind of ties together. I felt it was necessary. It was necessary to talk about television, and it all stems for me with there's never enough room to do all this stuff. And this time around, I'll say the same thing. There's so much and so little time to really get into the meat of television. So you have to do bits and pieces that we talk about. But ultimately, it kind of stems from Stephen King's It for me, where I was like, in the 90s, since we don't talk about television other than, say, references, you got to talk about it. You got to talk about Pennywise, and that sort of opened the door for me to want to do that for the 90s.
The film is completed, and if people still want to have a chance to own it now, well, not right now, but obviously it'll all come in November, December.
Yeah, jump on it.
But in completing the film and now taking a bit of a breather before starting on the next one, how excited are you now to delve into the second half of the decade?
I've been living the second half of the decade while I've been doing the first half of the decade, because for everyone I sat down with, I also talked about the second half of the decade, whether they had a project in it or whether they had films that they were fans of or television shows that they were fans of. And so I'm very excited because I already know. I mean, I'm going to do a lot more new interviews and new faces for the second half of the decade, but I already know all these amazing tales that I'm just chomping at the bit to share that I've had to save and will save for the next installment, which ideally will be coming a year from now when we'll be talking about all the other stuff. And, you know, in the second half of the 90s, you've got, in addition to Scream, which we talked about, we've got, the mainstream stuff. You know, you got the Blair Witch Project, you've got The Sixth Sense, you've got From Dusk Till Dawn, but you also have the beginning of the J horror, wave, Ringu, Audition. I mean, it's such an amazing time for horror, and I think by that time in the second half of the 90s, the innovation and the invention was just getting warmed up.
And now a public service horror announcement for all you horror fans out there.
Go to 90shorrordoc.com. We have a cutoff at Halloween night at midnight. And the reason for that is you get your name in the credits for this film, and all sorts of other cool swag and stuff like that. So the idea is, if you want, you help get this film over the line. We make it, manufacture it, and distribute it ourselves. First, you'll get a digital copy at the very end of November, and then we distribute the film ourselves, and you get it on Blu-ray to hold in your hands, where you have your name on the film alongside people I've mentioned before. Let's see, Heather Langenkamp, Kane Hodder, Screaming Mad George, Ernest Dickerson, David Desmalchian, you name them, John Carpenter. Your name is along these folks, with these folks, and it's. You get to be immortalized. But so you got to act and order it now by midnight Halloween at 90shorrordoc.com. All right, I'm done with my plug.
Thank you for joining us on Cine Bijou, where we shine a spotlight on independent films and the creative minds behind them who continuously push the boundaries of storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that like or follow button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also find us on social media. Why not follow us on Threads, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook for all the latest news, insights and views from the world of independent film. We also love hearing from you, our listeners and followers, so why not drop us a comment or maybe even send us a message. Until next time, keep listening, keep supporting, and help us keep the indie spirit alive.